Hello! Before you settle in, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Only if you like what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'm always curious to see who's joining us from around the world. What if history's most perplexing myth isn't a myth at all? What if Atlantis, far from being a fanciful invention, was a genuine civilization swallowed by the tides in a single catastrophic night? Or is it merely a philosophical parable dressed in captivating details? This video delves into Plato's original account of Atlantis, exploring the city's grandeur, its formidable army, and its staggering wealth. We'll examine the war with Athens, the cataclysmic event that erased Atlantis from the map, and the 1,000-year amnesia that followed. From the Fountain of Youth in Bimini to the icy landscapes of Antarctica, we'll explore why Atlantis remains an enduring enigma, captivating imaginations worldwide. The story of Atlantis doesn't begin with archaeological digs or ancient whispered legends. Its genesis lies in a text penned at a specific time by a specific individual, the Athenian philosopher Plato. Before Plato, the name Atlantis is conspicuously absent from all surviving sources, be it Sumerian cuneiform tablets, Egyptian inscriptions, or Greek lore. Everything we know today originates from two of Plato's dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. To grasp the birth of this tale, we must consider Plato's life, his ambitions, and the tumultuous world that shaped him. Plato was born in Athens during the 5th century BC, a city grappling with hardship. His family, steeped in aristocracy, wielded influence within political circles. Among his relatives were Charmides and Critias, figures involved in the oligarchic regime of the 30 tyrants that seized power after Athens' defeat in the Peloponnesian War. This war proved disastrous, bringing political decline, economic hardship, internal strife, epidemics, and a moral crisis to Athens. Young Plato witnessed the collapse of the old order, the shifting of regimes, and the descent into societal conflict. In his youth, Plato became a student of Socrates, a man who exerted a profound influence. Socrates, eschewing written treatises, embraced dialogue as a method for seeking truth. Plato watched as his teacher questioned the very foundations of Athenian democracy, accusing citizens of moral blindness and urging self-reflection. This path led to tragedy. Socrates was tried, convicted of corrupting the youth and impiety, and executed. Socrates' death was a devastating blow for Plato. He lost faith in Athenian democracy, concluding that a just society was impossible without citizens grounded in philosophical knowledge, ruled not by reason but by passions and greed. This conviction became the cornerstone of his work. In the early 4th century BC, Plato founded the Academy, the first philosophical school in history. There, he wrote his major works, including The Republic, an attempt to describe an ideal society. Within this intellectual crucible, the dialogues Timaeus and Critias emerged, introducing the story of Atlantis. Timaeus, written around 360 BC, appears at first glance to be a treatise on the structure of the world, the origin of the universe, the nature of the soul, and the movements of celestial bodies. But at the very beginning, almost as a prologue, lies the enigmatic tale of an ancient conflict between Athens and Atlantis, a mighty empire situated beyond the Pillars of Hercules, beyond the Mediterranean Sea. Plato doesn't present this story as his own. He attributes it to a specific chain of transmission. His great-grandfather, Critias the Younger, heard it from his grandfather, Critias the Elder, who heard it in childhood from Solon, the great Athenian lawgiver, 2 centuries earlier. Solon, in turn, heard it from Egyptian priests in Sais during his travels. Plato includes a dialogue in which an Egyptian priest tells Solon, "O Solon, Solon, you Greeks are always children." The priest chides Solon for the Greeks' lack of historical memory, attributing it to repeated destruction by wars and catastrophes, while the Egyptians had preserved written records for millennia. According to the priest, these records contained accounts of an event that occurred 9,000 years before Solon's time. A vast empire, Atlantis, possessed immense military and economic power. Atlantis attempted to subjugate the entire world, including Athens. But the Athenians, despite their limited resources, repelled the attack and preserved their freedom. Soon after, Atlantis was destroyed. In a single day and night, earthquakes and floods swallowed the island, and it vanished into the depths of the ocean. It's crucial to understand that Plato presents this account not as myth, but as a supposedly accurate historical tradition passed down through generations. It remains unclear whether he personally believed the story's authenticity or used it as a philosophical allegory. The context of Timaeus suggests that Plato was less interested in history than in using the story of Atlantis as an introduction to his reflections on the harmony of the universe and the structure of an ideal state. Yet, he strives to make the story plausible, naming specific participants, describing the location of meetings, and detailing the circumstances under which Solon learned the tale. Following Timaeus, Plato began work on Critias, intended to provide a detailed account of Atlantis, its government, architecture, customs, and way of life. However, the text breaks off mid-sentence. The reason is unknown. Perhaps Plato didn't finish it, or perhaps he deliberately left it incomplete. There was a plan to write a third dialogue, Hermocrates, to complete the story. But it was either never written or has been lost. Plato's contemporaries and philosophers of later eras regarded the story with skepticism. Aristotle directly asserted that Plato invented Atlantis to illustrate his views on moral decline, hubris, and the consequences of abandoning virtue. Over time, the line between philosophical parable and the search for a lost civilization began to blur. The main point to grasp is that Atlantis doesn't originate from folk myths, oral traditions, or ancient chronicles. Its story appears at a specific historical moment in a specific text, created by a specific individual. It's part of Plato's philosophical reflections on the fragility of states and civilizations when their foundations rest not on reason and virtue, but on greed, pride, and the lust for power. When Plato turns to describing Atlantis in Critias, he begins not with reflections on morality or politics, but with a detailed account of its geography, structure, resources, and appearance. According to him, Atlantis was located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient Greek name for the Strait of Gibraltar, separating the Mediterranean Sea from the Atlantic Ocean. The island was enormous, larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, occupying a vast space in the boundless ocean that the Greeks called the Outer Sea. The land's natural conditions were astonishing. Atlantis possessed fertile plains, broad valleys, and high mountains covered in dense forests, providing timber for shipbuilding and construction. Rivers flowed from the mountains, feeding lakes and canals. Hot springs provided hot and cold water for homes, gardens, and baths. The island teemed with animals, including herds of cattle, goats, sheep, and, notably, elephants, for whom there was ample food and space. The soil yielded abundant harvest of every imaginable grain, fruit, and vegetable. Orchards flourished with grapevines, olive groves, and groves of unusual fruits unknown to the Greeks. Besides familiar crops, the land produced rare and valuable plants used in medicine, crafts, and perfumery. The centre of Atlantis was a majestic city built around a hill, which, according to legend, was where the god Poseidon met and loved a mortal woman named Clito. To protect her, Poseidon surrounded the hill with 3 concentric rings of water and 2 rings of land, creating alternating zones connected by bridges. These rings had precise dimensions. The innermost canal was 300 feet wide, followed by a land belt of the same width, then another canal of 2 stadia, approximately 1,200 feet, then another land belt, and finally, the widest outer canal at 300 feet, connected to the sea by a dug channel. The city's infrastructure was remarkably well planned. All canals were interconnected and linked to the sea, allowing ships to enter the port and unload directly at the city walls. Wharves, shipyards, and armories lined the canal banks. Bridges spanned the canals, and the entrance to the central city was guarded by gates and towers. The city walls were constructed from 3 types of stone: white, black, and red, quarried on the island itself. These walls were covered with metal facings. The inner wall was sheathed in orichalcum, the middle in tin, and the outer in copper, giving the city a vibrant and beautiful appearance, especially in sunlight. At the city's heart stood a colossal temple dedicated to Poseidon and Clito, entirely clad in silver on the outside and orichalcum on the inside. Within the temple was a gigantic statue of Poseidon riding a chariot drawn by 6 winged horses. Around the god stood statues of his 10 sons born of Clito, each of whom became the ruler of one of the 10 regions of Atlantis. Nearby stood the royal palace, a complex of halls, rooms, gardens, and terraces. Its floors were inlaid with mosaics of ivory, precious stones, and gold. The walls were panelled with orichalcum and covered with copper sheets, while the roofs were adorned with tin inlays. The inner gardens were filled with exotic plants, freshwater and saltwater pools, fountains and promenades. The Atlantean economy was built on advanced agriculture, mining, craftsmanship, and international trade. The central plain surrounding the city was a vast rectangle, divided into sections by a system of parallel canals, 100 feet wide and spaced 300 feet apart. Transverse canals connected them, providing drainage, irrigation, and transportation. Each region had its own military and economic specialization. Plato describes in detail how supplies were organized, taxes collected, and the army mobilized. For example, he specifies how many chariots, infantrymen, archers, and ships each region was required to provide in case of war. A strict system of accounting and management was based on ancient laws given by the first ruler, Atlas, and his brothers. The political structure of Atlantis was a union of 10 kingdoms, each ruled by a descendant of Poseidon. Supreme power belonged to the eldest of the kings, the ruler of the central city, but the others retained considerable autonomy. All important decisions were made in a common council, which met periodically at the Temple of Poseidon. Before the council began, the king swore an oath of allegiance to the gods and to each other, performing a sacred rite. They hunted a bull without weapons, sacrificed it, washed their hands in its blood, and then, standing before the altar, swore to uphold the laws, defend justice, and maintain order. For a long time, Atlantis flourished. Its inhabitants strictly observed the laws, honoured the gods, preserved morality, and cared for their society's well-being. Luxury didn't blind them, wealth didn't corrupt their souls, and power didn't turn into tyranny. Atlantis was a state in which the divine spark in humans still retained its strength, and thanks to this, society remained harmonious and stable. But as generations passed, the divine nature in the souls of the Atlanteans began to weaken. Increasingly, their actions reflected vice and injustice, greed, the pursuit of profit, pride, and avarice. The splendour of the palaces grew, the festivals became more extravagant, the armies more aggressive, and the rulers less inclined to keep their sacred oaths and care for the well-being of their subjects. It is from this moment, Plato emphasizes, that the gradual decline of Atlantis begins. The great power, once founded on harmony with the gods and nature, began to deviate from the laws of its ancestors. Instead of seeking justice and maintaining order, the Atlanteans began to strive to expand their power beyond the island, subjugating neighbouring lands and accumulating wealth at any cost. At this point, Plato's description of Atlantis ends. His narrative shifts to the consequences of this gradual moral decay, how Atlantis sought to rule the world, clashed with the free Athenians, and ultimately met its own destruction. When Plato, in his dialogue Critias, turns to the story of Atlantis' fate, he begins with the moment when the great island, having attained unprecedented power, ceased to be satisfied with its own wealth, order, and prosperity, and turned its gaze to the entire known world, seeking to extend its dominion over all lands on both sides of the Pillars of Hercules. According to the Egyptian priests from whom, according to Plato, this story originated, Atlantis, having subjugated numerous islands and significant territories on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, extended its power over Libya as far as the borders of Egypt and over Europe as far as Tyrrhenia. The peoples of these lands were obliged to pay tribute, provide troops, ships, livestock, metals, and everything that Atlantis required to maintain its power. The desire for further conquest was driven not by concern for security or the need for resources, but by internal decay, by the moral crisis that began when the divine spark in the souls of the Atlanteans began to weaken. Increasingly, their behaviour was determined by greed, avarice, and the pursuit of unlimited power. It was at this moment that the rulers of Atlantis decided to subjugate Athens, a city that, according to the priests, was then very different from what it became in later times. This ancient Athens, as Plato recounts, was a society built not on luxury or military might, but on the principles of virtue, justice, and strict adherence to the laws given by the goddess Athena. The citizens lived simply, worked diligently, honoured the gods, and cared not so much about accumulating wealth as about harmony among themselves and with nature. Athens represented an ideal polis, in which reason, law, and mutual respect, not money or force, ruled. When the rulers of Atlantis decided to conquer Athens, they sent envoys to demand submission, recognize Atlantis' supremacy, and begin paying tribute, as other nations already did. The Athenians' response was unequivocal. They rejected any infringement on their freedom and refused to submit to foreign rule. Moreover, They immediately began preparing for war, understanding that compromise was impossible. Soon, Atlantis began mobilizing. According to Plato's description, the Atlantean army was grandiose in scale, with thousands of chariots, tens of thousands of infantrymen, numerous cavalry units, and a vast fleet capable of transporting troops across oceans and enforcing a prolonged coastal blockade. The city's shipyards worked non-stop, forging weapons, building new ships, and stockpiling provisions. The army was equipped with the best weapons of its time: bronze armour, swords, spears, shields, and siege engines. The Athenians, realizing that they would face an enemy vastly superior in numbers and material resources, conducted a total mobilization. Men of all ages capable of bearing arms joined the army. The city prepared for defense, strengthening walls, building additional fortifications, stockpiling food, and stockpiling weapons. But most importantly, the Athenians relied on the strength of unity, the courage of their citizens, and the help of the gods who protected them. The first stage of the war was a naval blockade. Atlantis sent a fleet to the shores of Attica, tasked with cutting off sea routes, depriving Athens of trade and supplies, and then landing troops to storm the city. The Athenians, anticipating this, built fast and maneuverable ships, much lighter and better suited for coastal battles than the heavy warships of the Atlanteans. The naval battles were fierce and protracted. The Athenians attacked enemy ships at night, set up ambushes in bays, laid traps among the rocks, and skillfully used their knowledge of local waters. Despite their numerical superiority, the Atlanteans failed to achieve success at sea. After several major defeats, they realized that capturing Athens by sea was impossible, and shifted to preparing a land operation. An army landed on the coast of Attica and began advancing towards the city walls, expecting to take Athens in a short time. However, the Athenians used the strategic advantages of the terrain. They fortified mountain passes, built barricades, mined approaches to key roads, and prepared defensive positions on hills and in gorges. The fighting on land lasted not days or weeks, but months. The Athenians waged a flexible defence, transitioning to sudden counterattacks, setting up ambushes, striking at convoys, destroying supply lines, and disrupting communications. The Atlanteans, accustomed to swift victories and complete dominance, found themselves drawn into a protracted war in which their numerical superiority gave them less and less advantage. They lost soldiers in the mountains, their units were depleted in fruitless attacks on fortifications, and attempts to break through to the city were constantly thwarted. The culmination of this campaign was a major battle in which the Athenians, using a feigned retreat, lured the main forces of the Atlanteans into a narrow valley where ambushes had been prepared in advance. From three sides, a barrage of arrows, stones, and infantry strikes rained down on the enemy. The surrounded Atlanteans tried to break through, but the terrain did not allow them to deploy chariots or use heavy infantry. The battle ended in a complete rout of the Atlantean army. Simultaneously, the Athenians struck a devastating blow against the enemy fleet. While the main forces of the Atlanteans were engaged in battle on land, light Athenian ships attacked enemy vessels, burning those at anchor and sinking heavy transports, depriving the enemy of the ability to evacuate. The remnants of the Atlantean army, losing contact with the fleet and suffering enormous losses, fled. This victory was absolute. The Athenians not only defended their land, but also proved that virtue, unity, courage, and loyalty to the laws could surpass any numerical and material superiority, They did not pursue the fleeing enemy, and did not present demands to the defeated. Athens did not seek conquest. It only defended what was most important to it: its freedom, its independence, and its laws. Thus ended the war between Athens and Atlantis, a great battle in which a civilization based on justice, virtue, and respect for the gods prevailed over a state where wealth, power, and greed for power had overshadowed moral foundations. However, the story of Atlantis itself did not end there. Defeated, humiliated, and weakened, Atlantis soon faced another far more terrible enemy: the forces of nature, against which neither armies nor fleets nor riches could stand. When Plato, in his dialogue Critias, approaches the climax of his story, he describes the moment when the gods, observing Atlantis, could no longer remain indifferent to how a people who had once lived according to their precepts had completely lost their virtues, succumbed to greed, arrogance, and the pursuit of unlimited power. The island, which had once been the embodiment of harmony, order, and justice, ceased to follow the laws established by Poseidon for his descendants, thereby violating the fundamental order laid down in the world by the gods. Zeus, the ruler of Olympus, gathered all the immortals in his hall to discuss what punishment should befall Atlantis for its pride, for its rejection of piety, its betrayal of justice, and its placing of its own power above the will of the gods. Plato describes this moment in detail: how Zeus addresses the other gods, how he rises above them, looking down at the earth and begins to speak. But we never hear his speech. It is at this moment that the dialogue breaks off. Nevertheless, the end of the story is obvious. Plato unequivocally says that soon after these events Atlantis disappeared. The catastrophe was sudden and devastating. In a single day and night, the island was swallowed by monstrous earthquakes and huge waves. The earth cracked, the soil split open, and torrents of water washed away cities, temples, palaces, and all fortifications. Everything that had been created by generations, canals, piers, gardens, temples, markets, dwellings, and neighbourhoods, vanished as if it had never existed. The island sank. Where the temples of Poseidon had recently stood, where the palaces of kings had risen, and where the bustling ports had thronged, now remained only the empty sea. Plato specifies that in place of Atlantis, shoals and muddy shallows formed, which for a long time hindered navigation. Sailing through these waters became dangerous, as submerged ruins and sandbanks made the sea impassable for ships. The destruction of Atlantis, as emphasized by the Egyptian priests in Plato's account, was not a random whim of nature or the result of an accidental natural disaster. It was a direct consequence of the moral decay of its inhabitants. The gods did not care how rich their temples were, how powerful their armies had become, or how extensive their trade networks were. The only thing that mattered was preserving the order based on harmony between people and the cosmos, on respect for laws and gods, and on virtue and justice. When this order was violated, when the inhabitants of Atlantis rejected the commandments of their ancestors and replaced them with a thirst for power and wealth, destruction became inevitable. First, Atlantis lost the war to Athens, which according to Plato was then a model of justice and moral order. And soon after came the blow from nature itself, controlled by the will of the gods. But the moment of the catastrophe itself, despite its obvious significance, remains almost without description in Plato's dialogues. He only reports the result, the destruction of the island, but does not describe the process itself. He does not recount how the walls collapsed, how the palaces were flooded, how people fled, how the canals were torn apart, how ships broke from their moorings and plunged into the abyss along with the cities. Why does the story break off? There is no answer. Perhaps Plato deliberately left the story untold so that everyone who heard it would reflect on the causes, the consequences, and the meaning of this destruction. Perhaps he wanted to emphasize that the essence is not in the details of the destruction, but in its inevitability as a consequence of the loss of virtue. Or perhaps the reason was more prosaic. The text was simply not completed, or its ending was lost. It is known that Plato planned a third part of the trilogy, a dialogue called Hermocrates, which was to complete the cycle begun in Timaeus and continued in Critias. The content of this work remains a mystery, but most researchers believe that it was supposed to either describe the consequences of the destruction of Atlantis or provide a philosophical summary of the entire story, showing how the lessons of this catastrophe should be understood by future generations. In any case, the destruction of Atlantis, as described by Plato, remains not just a story about the destruction of one island. It is a story about how even the most powerful civilizations possessing immense wealth, powerful armies, great cities, and incredible technological achievements remain vulnerable if they lose their internal support: virtue, justice, and respect for the divine order. Atlantis disappeared. It ceased to exist both physically and in the history of that time. But the memory of it did not disappear completely. This memory continued to live in stories, in rare records, in echoes of myths, although for many centuries its history almost vanished from human consciousness. After Plato told the world the story of Atlantis, the fate of this legend for many centuries was almost forgotten. The immediate generations of ancient thinkers perceived it more as a philosophical parable than as a real account of the past. Even Aristotle, Plato's student, argued that his teacher invented Atlantis for didactic purposes, to illustrate his own ideas about laws, morality, and the structure of an ideal state. In subsequent centuries, virtually none of the major historians, neither Herodotus, nor Polybius, nor Strabo, nor Pliny the Elder, showed interest in this story. It rarely appeared in geographical works, historical chronicles, or philosophical essays. The perception of Atlantis gradually narrowed to the point where it was regarded only as a figurative example, intended to show what leads to the loss of virtue and the rejection of the laws of the gods. In late antiquity, when Neoplatonism replaced classical philosophy, the name of Atlantis still surfaced occasionally, but only as an allegory. Philosophers discussing the structure of the cosmos, the immortality of the soul, or the laws of order might mention it, but not as a real place, but as a symbol of the fall and destruction inevitable for any civilization that has lost its connection with the divine order. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed and the Middle Ages began, interest in ancient philosophical traditions almost completely faded. Europe entered an era in which questions of morality, theology, and the salvation of the soul became more important than any reflections on the past, geography, or the nature of the world. Plato's dialogues continued to exist. They were copied in monasteries, stored in the libraries of Constantinople, and studied in the Muslim world. But the story of Atlantis itself in these texts remained something secondary, almost imperceptible against the backdrop of other ideas. Medieval thinkers did not reject the existence of Atlantis outright. They rather showed no interest in it. Biblical tales, stories of Sodom and Gomorrah, of the flood, and of the Tower of Babel took the place of this story. And if they remembered Atlantis at all, it was most often in the context of general discussions about how God punishes proud and sinful peoples. Sometimes it was mentioned in commentaries on Plato, in rare encyclopedias, or in treatises by Byzantine authors. But these mentions were always brief and lacked independent significance. Even medieval cartographers, drawing a world populated by wonders and unknown lands, almost never included Atlantis on their maps. Their imagination gave birth to images of the islands of the blessed, of Eden, of the islands of saints, or of places where, according to legend, relics of Christianity were hidden. But the idea of a continent sunk beyond the ocean did not become part of the medieval imagination. And yet the legend did not disappear. It continued to exist in transcribed copies of Plato's dialogues. It was preserved in the works of Arab scholars, in the Library of Constantinople, and in the works of a few Byzantine philosophers and theologians who retained an interest in the legacy of antiquity. Atlantis did not sound loud, but its name did not completely disappear from cultural memory. It was this silent presence that allowed it to survive the Middle Ages. And when Europe once again began to pay attention to the legacy of antiquity, when the era of the Renaissance and the great geographical discoveries began, the name of Atlantis once again proved to be in demand. New hypotheses, attempts to find its traces in the oceans, and the idea that it might be connected with the New World or Lost Islands were ahead. With the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance, interest in the legacy of antiquity in Europe rapidly revived. Plato's works, including the dialogues in which the story of Atlantis first appeared, were once again studied. What for centuries had been perceived only as a philosophical parable, now once again became the subject of serious reflection, not only among philosophers, but also among geographers, travellers, navigators, and cartographers. It was during this period that Europe went beyond its familiar boundaries. Portuguese and Spanish ships crossed the Pillars of Hercules, ventured into the Atlantic Ocean, and found new islands and lands, the existence of which ancient geographers had not even suspected. The appearance on the maps of the Azores, the Canary Islands, Madeira, and many other territories prompted reflection. Could these lands be the remnants of the once vast island described by Plato? During this time, the idea gradually formed that the story of Atlantis was not just a philosophical allegory, but perhaps a memory of a real, sunken civilization. And the Azores became the first candidate for the role of its tracers. Their location in the very centre of the Atlantic Ocean, far beyond the Pillars of Hercules, coincided with Plato's description. Moreover, the mountainous nature of the archipelago suggested that these might be the peaks of a sunken continent that once rose above the ocean. The Canary Islands were also actively considered. Researchers drew attention to their ancient inhabitants, the Guanches, who before the arrival of Europeans preserved a unique culture, unusual rituals and legends about ancestors who came from large lands that disappeared into the sea. These traditions began to be associated with memories of Atlantis, suggesting that the Guanches might be the last descendants of those who survived the catastrophe. But the most audacious hypothesis appeared with the discovery of America. Soon after Christopher Columbus's voyage and the discovery of the New World, voices began to be heard suggesting that Atlantis was America. The vast continent hidden beyond the ocean seemed an ideal candidate for the role of the sunken world. This idea was prompted not only by the size of the continent, but also by the astonishing achievements of the indigenous civilizations, the Maya, the Aztecs, and the Incas. Their cities, temples, roads, An astronomical knowledge amazed the Europeans, and it seemed to many that such a high level of development simply could not have arisen without a connection to some ancient, highly developed civilization. These ideas were reflected in the works of philosophers, chroniclers, and geographers. On maps of the 16th century, it was not uncommon to see the inscription Atlantis, or Island of Atlantis, placed in various locations in the Atlantic Ocean, from the area of Bermuda to the Caribbean islands and the coast of Brazil. Some cartographers suggested that Atlantis was a giant sunken continent. Others depicted it as a chain of islands left after the catastrophe. Simultaneously, the first attempts to explain the disappearance of Atlantis from the perspective of natural processes began to be heard. Increasingly, versions appeared that the island could have sunk as a result of powerful earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, slow subsidence of the Earth's crust, or giant tsunamis. This idea seemed especially plausible in light of the fact that such catastrophes had indeed occurred. For example, the eruption of the volcano on Santorini, which destroyed the Minoan civilization, became for many a kind of model for the destruction of Atlantis. Nevertheless, despite the enormous interest, no convincing evidence of the existence of Atlantis could be found. Neither in the Azores, nor in the Canaries, nor in America, nor in the Caribbean Sea did archaeologists discover ruins, artifacts, or evidence of a civilization comparable to the description given by Plato. And yet, the very possibility that beyond the horizon there existed a land that might turn out to be Atlantis continued to stir the imagination. Gradually, interest in Atlantis went beyond purely geographical or historical searches. It began to become part of literary utopias, philosophical reflections on the fate of civilizations, and a source of inspiration for writers, travellers, and even mystics. The legend began to acquire new meanings. Now it was no longer just a story about the destruction of a proud people, but a symbol of a lost golden age, an ideal society that had sunk under the water but continued to live in the dreams of humanity. And yet, the real explosion of interest in Atlantis, its transformation into one of the most discussed and popular mysteries of its time, would occur only in the 19th century with the appearance of people who reinterpreted it not only as a philosophical myth, but as a real, material civilization, the existence of which could supposedly be proven. By the beginning of the 19th century, the legend of Atlantis ceased to be just an episode from Plato's works, and turned into an independent cultural phenomenon, arousing interest far beyond academic discussions. It became a subject of discussion among writers, travellers, seekers of ancient knowledge, and supporters of lost civilizations, and later among the first researchers who tried to rely on the achievements of science. Several factors contributed to this. First, the 19th century was an era of archaeological discoveries, when Europeans began to realize that many ancient legends and myths concealed real events. It was then that Pompeii was opened, Troy was excavated, and excavations of Nineveh and Memphis began. Each such success seemed to confirm the idea that myth is not always fiction, but sometimes a distorted memory of real civilizations. Second, the 19th century was a time of rapid flourishing of esoteric teachings, interest in occult knowledge, secret societies, and the search for the lost spiritual heritage of humanity. In this system of views, Atlantis easily turned into a symbol of not just a perished civilization, but also of a lost golden age, when people supposedly possessed knowledge and abilities long forgotten in the modern world. A key event was the publication of a book by the American writer, publicist, and politician Ignatius Donnelly. His work, entitled Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, instantly became an international sensation. In this book, Donnelly argued that Atlantis was not a myth or a philosophical allegory, but a real, highly developed civilization that stood at the origins of all known cultures of the ancient world. He built a long chain of arguments, comparing myths, legends, architectural traditions, and cultural features of the peoples of Europe, Africa, and America. In his opinion, the disappearance of Atlantis was associated with a global natural disaster, as a result of which a huge continent located in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean sank. Donnelly believed that it was the Atlanteans who spread knowledge of agriculture, metallurgy, navigation, architecture, and writing throughout the world. His book quickly became a source of inspiration for a whole wave of followers. From this moment on, Atlantis ceased to be a topic exclusively for academic disputes. Now everyone was discussing it: researchers, geographers, writers, and mystics. A huge number of hypotheses about its location appeared. Some continued to look for it in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, others suggested that it could have been South America, a third pointed to the Caribbean basin, and a fourth to Antarctica, or even the Arctic. In parallel with this, interest in Atlantis grew in mystical and occult circles. Its image was especially actively used in the theosophical teachings of Helena Blavatsky. According to her version, Atlantis was not just an island or a continent, but an entire era in the history of humanity. An era when a special race, the Atlanteans, possessed supernatural abilities and spiritual knowledge, supposedly ruled the earth. In her texts, Atlantis turned into a projection of the Golden Age, which perished because its inhabitants abandoned the spiritual path for the sake of power, matter, and technological might. Based on these ideas, dozens of new versions arose. The Atlanteans began to be credited with the invention of aircraft, the use of crystals to generate energy, the control of a weather phenomena, telepathy, and the ability to influence matter with the power of thought. All this was intertwined with myths, conjectures, occult teachings, and fantasies that spread with incredible speed. Atlantis became an integral part of the artistic culture of the 19th century. It was described in adventure novels, in science fiction works, and in utopias. It appeared on the pages of newspapers, in popular brochures, and in reports of geographical societies. Gradually, the image of Atlantis went beyond the framework of ancient myth and turned into a universal symbol, a symbol of a lost ideal, a vanished paradise, and a mystery that humanity strives to solve. However, it is important to note that all these hypotheses, no matter how spectacular and impressive their presentation, almost did not rely on real archaeology and legiology. They were based on a comparison of myths, interpretations of legends, free analogies, and personal guesses of the authors. The scientific community of the 19th century, although observing this boom with interest, treated it with obvious skepticism. Nevertheless, it was at this time that an important transition began. The first researchers appeared who decided to test the hypothesis about the existence of Atlantis not only at the level of mythology and texts, but also with the help of scientific tools. The first underwater studies, geological expeditions, and work on studying the structure of the ocean floor appeared. Atlantis, from the field of philosophical and mystical reasoning, began to gradually move into the sphere of scientific inquiry. By the beginning of the 20th century, the legend of Atlantis finally transitioned from the realm of philosophical reflections, mythology, and esotericism to a sphere where it began to be regarded as a potentially real historical mystery. Fantasies, mystical fabrications, and hypotheses without evidence were replaced by attempts to rely on data from archaeology, geology, and oceanography. For the first time in thousands of years, the myth of Atlantis became the subject of systematic scientific interest. One of the most serious and influential hypotheses of the 20th century became the version linking Atlantis with the catastrophe that occurred on the island of Santorini in the Aegean Sea. In the middle of the century, archaeologists discovered a well-preserved Bronze Age city, Akrotiri, beneath a layer of volcanic ash. Its streets, houses, frescoes, sewage systems and developed infrastructure were striking in their high level of culture. Researchers concluded that a powerful volcanic eruption in the early 16th century BC destroyed this city and dealt a devastating blow to the Minoan civilization of Crete. It was this catastrophe, accompanied by giant tsunamis, earthquakes, and prolonged climatic changes, that became the model that began to be compared with the destruction of Atlantis. This was indicated by signs of a high level of development, the suddenness of the catastrophe, and the actual disappearance of an entire civilization. However, the main argument against this hypothesis is geography. Santorini is located not beyond the Pillars of Hercules, as Plato wrote, but within the Mediterranean Sea. In addition, the discrepancy in time is thousands of years. Plato claims that Atlantis perished 9,000 years before Solon, that is, in the 10th millennium BC, much earlier than the eruption of Santorini. Another wave of interest was associated with the discovery in 1968, off the coast of Bimini, a small island in the Bahamas, of strange underwater stone structures called the Bimini Road. Even, regular-shaped blocks laid in a long line at first glance resembled ruins, walls, or paved roads. Photographs quickly spread around the world, and statements that these were the remains of Atlantis appeared in newspapers and magazines literally within days of the discovery. However, further studies showed that the Bimini Road is a natural geological formation, the result of natural stratification and erosion of limestone slabs common in this region. Scientists found similar formations in other places in the Caribbean basin, which confirmed its natural origin. Nevertheless, for many supporters of the existence of Atlantis, Bimini long remained a symbolic proof that it could have existed. A separate line of hypotheses leads the search for Atlantis to completely unexpected places, to Antarctica. This theory became especially popular in the second half of the 20th century thanks to the work of Charles Hapgood, who put forward a hypothesis about the displacement of the Earth's crust. According to his version, Antarctica in the distant past was located in warmer latitudes, was free of ice, and could serve as a home for a developed civilization. The movement of the Earth's crust led to the fact that the continent ended up at the pole, froze, and became inaccessible for life. These ideas found many supporters among lovers of mysteries and alternative history, but did not withstand criticism from the scientific community. Modern data on the geological past of Antarctica show that the continent has been covered with ice for at least several million years, and could not have been the site of a civilization similar